The photograph arrived at Bennett's restoration studio on a cold March morning in 2024, tucked inside a weathered cardboard box alongside 24 other Victorian portraits. David Bennett had been restoring antique photographs for 15 years, but something about this particular image made him pause before even removing it from its protective sleeve. The portrait showed a girl of perhaps 6 years old, dressed in an elaborate white lace dress with ribbons woven through her dark hair. She sat rigidly in an ornate chair, her small hands folded in her lap, her expression unnaturally solemn for a child. The photography studio's name was embossed in faded gold letters at the bottom: Whitmore & Sons, New York, 1903. David carefully placed the photograph under his magnification lamp and began his initial assessment. The image quality was remarkable for its age, the focus sharp, the contrast well preserved despite over a century of existence. But there was something unsettling about the girl's eyes. They weren't looking directly at the camera. Instead, her gaze seemed fixed on something just beyond the photographer's shoulder, something that had captured her attention completely. He adjusted the lamp and leaned closer. The girl's pupils were slightly dilated, her expression frozen in what he now recognized as fear, not the typical stoicism of Victorian portrait subjects. Professional curiosity pulled him deeper into the image. David reached for his digital microscope, a tool he used for detecting damage invisible to the naked eye. As he positioned it over the girl's right eye and adjusted the magnification, his breath caught. There, in the curved reflection of her cornea, was something that shouldn't be there. A shape, a figure, captured in that split second when the shutter opened. His hands trembled slightly as he increased the magnification further. The reflection became clearer and David felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't just a photograph anymore. This was evidence. David stared at the monitor for 20 minutes without moving, his coffee growing cold beside him. The digital microscope revealed what no one in 1903 could have possibly seen. The optical technology simply hadn't existed. But in 2024, with equipment capable of magnifying details thousands of times, the girl's eyes had become windows into a moment that someone had desperately wanted to hide. The reflection showed a woman in a long dress, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, one arm reaching upward as if trying to break a fall. Behind her, barely visible, was the dark outline of another figure, taller, broader. The woman's posture suggested violence, not accident. The positioning of the shadow figure suggested intent. David's mind raced through possibilities. Could this be a trick of light? A smudge on the original photograph that coincidentally resembled a human form? He'd seen pareidolia before, the human brain's tendency to see faces and figures in random patterns. But this was too detailed, too anatomically precise. He switched to the girl's left eye and carefully mapped the same area. The angle was slightly different, providing stereoscopic confirmation. The woman was real. The figure behind her was real, and the girl had been looking directly at them when the photographer triggered the shutter. David pulled up his database of Victorian photography techniques. In 1903, exposure times had shortened considerably from the early days of daguerreotypes, but they still required subjects to remain absolutely still for several seconds. The photographer would have been focused entirely on the girl, ensuring she didn't move, adjusting the light, preparing the plate. He wouldn't have been watching what was happening behind him, but the girl had seen everything. Her eyes had recorded it with the precision of the camera itself, and now, 121 years later, that terrible moment had been discovered. David reached for his phone, then hesitated. Who exactly do you call when you find evidence of a possible crime that occurred before anyone alive today was born? David spent the next 3 days photographing and documenting every detail of the portrait before he contacted anyone. He created dozens of high-resolution scans, mapped the reflections in both eyes, and built a 3-dimensional reconstruction of what the girl had been seeing. The woman in the reflection became clearer with each enhancement. She was falling backward, her face contorted in terror or pain, her hand grasping at empty air. The studio was located in Lower Manhattan, now a trendy neighborhood of converted lofts and boutique coffee shops. But in 1903, it had been a respectable commercial district. David found references to Whitmore & Sons in old city directories. They'd operated from 1898 until 1911, specializing in family portraits and memorial photographs. He finally called Rebecca Torres, a historical researcher he'd worked with on previous projects. She arrived at his studio within an hour, her skepticism visible in her expression, until she looked through the microscope herself. "My God," she whispered, adjusting the focus. "That's not an artifact. That's a genuine reflection. Can we identify her?" David asked. "The woman in the reflection?" Rebecca straightened, her mind already working through the research process. "If this girl came from a family wealthy enough to afford a professional portrait, there will be records. Census data, society columns, birth certificates. The studio would have kept appointment books. We need to find out who this child was." They started with the photograph itself, examining every detail for clues. The girl's dress suggested upper-middle-class wealth, expensive but not ostentatious. Her jewelry was minimal, appropriate for a child. The chair she sat in was part of the studio's standard props, visible in other Whitmore and Sons photographs they found in digital archives. Rebecca pulled up the 1900 census records for Manhattan families with young daughters. There were hundreds. They needed something more specific, a name, an address, anything to narrow the search. David examined the photograph's backing, hoping for an inscription, but found only the studio's printed information and a faint number. 847. "That could be a reference number," Rebecca said. If Whitmore kept systematic records, this would correspond to their appointment book or negative archive. The question was whether any of those records had survived. The New York Historical Society's photograph collection occupied an entire floor of their research facility. Rebecca had called ahead, and the archivist, an elderly man named Howard Chen, met them in the reading room with 3 leather-bound ledgers that smelled of old paper and time. "Whitmore and Sons," Howard said, placing the books carefully on the padded table. "We acquired these when the building was demolished in 1967. Most studios from that era didn't keep such detailed records, but Whitmore was meticulous." David's hands shook slightly as he opened the first ledger. The entries were written in elegant copperplate script, each one noting the date, client name, type of portrait, and reference number. He flipped through 1902, then found 1903. His finger traced down the page until he reached entry 847, March 15, 1903. Miss Eleanor Ashford, age 6. Family portrait sitting. Parents, Mr. James Ashford, Mrs. Catherine Ashford. Address 247 Madison Avenue. "Eleanor Ashford," Rebecca breathed, immediately pulling out her laptop. "Now we have a name." Howard leaned over their shoulders. "Ashford. That name is familiar. I believe we have some society papers from that family in our manuscript collection." While Howard disappeared into the stacks, Rebecca searched online databases. "Here," she said, turning her screen toward David. "Catherine Ashford, née Catherine Morrison. Born 1875, married James Ashford in 1895. Died March 17, 1903. David felt ice spread through his chest. 2 days after the photograph was taken, Rebecca clicked through to the death certificate, which had been digitized years earlier. Cause of death: accidental fall resulting in head trauma. Location: family residence, 247 Madison Avenue. The certificate was signed by a Dr. William Harrison and witnessed by James Ashford himself. "An accidental fall," David said slowly. That happened to occur just 2 days after this photograph captured her falling in the studio. Rebecca was already searching for more information. James Ashford was a banker, prominent in New York society. The family had significant wealth. After Catherine's death, he remarried within a year to a woman named Victoria Hartley. Howard returned with a slim folder containing newspaper clippings and personal correspondence. The obituary for Catherine Ashford was brief and formal, noting her charitable work and surviving family. But tucked between the pages was something else, a letter, dated April 1903, written in an agitated, barely legible hand. The letter was addressed to Catherine's sister, Margaret Morrison, who lived in Boston. David and Rebecca read it together under Howard's watchful supervision, their gloves protecting the fragile paper. "Dearest Margaret, I write to you in profound distress regarding Catherine's death. The official account troubles me greatly. I visited the house the day after her passing, and the servants were terrified, speaking in whispers. The housekeeper, Mrs. Walsh, pulled me aside and said things that I dare not commit to paper in detail. But she insists Catherine's fall was not accidental. James has forbidden anyone from speaking of the circumstances. He dismissed Mrs. Walsh the very next day, and the other servants have been threatened with loss of position should they speak. Eleanor has not uttered a word since her mother died. The child simply stares, as if she has witnessed something too terrible for speech. I have attempted to raise concerns with the police, but James's connections make him untouchable. I fear for Eleanor's well-being. James has already begun courting Miss Hartley, a woman 30 years his junior. I believe Catherine discovered something about James's business dealings, or perhaps something more personal, and he silenced her. I beg you to help me find a way to protect Eleanor and to ensure Catherine receives justice. But I fear we are powerless against a man of James's standing. Your devoted sister, Margaret. Rebecca looked up from the letter. Did Margaret ever succeed in helping Eleanor? Howard pulled out another document. There's a follow-up letter from 3 months later. Margaret mentions that she was denied access to Eleanor and that James threatened legal action if she persisted. After that, the correspondence stops. David felt rage building in his chest. So he got away with it. He killed his wife, terrified his daughter into silence, and married someone else within a year. It was easier then, Rebecca said quietly. Wealthy men had enormous power. Servants could be dismissed or paid off. Doctors could be persuaded to sign convenient death certificates. And a 6-year-old child's testimony, even if she could speak, would have been dismissed. David looked at the photograph again, at Eleanor's haunted eyes. But she couldn't speak, could she? The trauma made her mute. Selective mutism is a documented response to severe psychological trauma, Rebecca confirmed. Eleanor witnessed her mother's murder and was powerless to stop it or tell anyone about it. Over the next week, David and Rebecca pieced together Eleanor Ashford's life with growing sorrow. Census records showed her living with James and his new wife Victoria through 1910. School records indicated she attended Miss Porter's School for Young Ladies, a prestigious institution in Connecticut, from 1908 to 1914. A note from the school's medical records, preserved in their archive, mentioned that Eleanor continues to suffer from nervous affliction and refuses verbal communication, though she excels at written composition and artistic expression. She found other ways to communicate, Rebecca observed, but she never spoke about what she saw. They found Eleanor's marriage certificate from 1920. She married a man named Thomas Whitfield, a professor of literature at Columbia University. The wedding was small, held in a church in Greenwich Village, with no mention of her father in attendance. David tracked down property records and found that Eleanor and Thomas had lived in a brownstone on West 11th Street until Thomas's death in 1945. Eleanor remained there alone until her own death in 1978, at the age of 81. Did she ever have children? David asked. Rebecca shook her head. No record of any. But look at this. She pulled up an article from a 1952 issue of the New York Times. It was a small piece in the arts section, noting an anonymous donation of $50,000 to establish a foundation supporting women escaping domestic violence. The donation came from a trust established by Eleanor Whitfield, Rebecca said. And there's more. Between 1945 and her death, Eleanor donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to similar causes: women's shelters, legal aid for abuse victims, counseling services. She spent her entire adult life helping women in situations like her mother's. David felt tears prickling his eyes. She couldn't save her mother, so she saved everyone else she could. They found Eleanor's obituary, which was longer and more detailed than her mother's had been. It described her as a quiet philanthropist and champion of vulnerable women, noting that she had never given interviews or sought public recognition for her work. The obituary mentioned that she was predeceased by her husband and had no surviving family. One detail caught David's attention. Eleanor had requested cremation, with her ashes scattered in the Hudson River. No funeral service, no memorial, no grave marker. It was as if she wanted to disappear completely, leaving no trace except the lives she had helped and the photograph that had captured the worst moment of her childhood. While Rebecca continued researching Eleanor's life, David turned his attention to James Ashford. What he found painted a picture of a man who had indeed escaped justice and prospered from it. James's banking career flourished after Catherine's death. By 1910, he was a partner in Ashford and Sterling, one of Manhattan's most prominent investment firms. His second wife, Victoria, bore him 2 sons, James Jr. and William. Society columns from the era showed the family attending galas, hosting dinner parties, and moving in the highest circles of New York wealth. But there were cracks in the perfect facade. David found a series of articles from 1908 about a scandal involving Ashford and Sterling, allegations of fraud and embezzlement that were quietly settled out of court. Several investors had accused James of misappropriating funds and falsifying documents. Catherine must have discovered it, Rebecca said when David showed her the articles. The timeline matches. March 1903, right before her death. That's when the fraudulent investments were being made. If she found the documents, if she threatened to expose him, he had motive, David finished. Financial ruin, social disgrace, possibly criminal charges. And Catherine would have had the evidence. They found more shadows in James's history. A servant named Patrick O'Connor filed a complaint with the police in 1905, claiming James had assaulted him. The case was dismissed. A business partner named Henry Chen sued James in 1912 for breach of contract. The suit was settled confidentially. There were whispers, rumors, hints of a violent temper and ruthless business practices. James died in 1931, at age 62, of a heart attack. His obituary was glowing, describing him as a titan of industry and pillar of the community. His sons inherited the firm and continued its operations until the 1960s. There was no mention of Catherine, his first wife, or Eleanor, his daughter from that marriage. History remembers him as successful and respectable, David said bitterly, while Catherine was forgotten and Eleanor lived in silence. Rebecca pulled up one final document, Victoria Ashford's will, filed after her death in 1954. She had left substantial sums to her two sons, to various charities, and to the Episcopal Church. But there was one name conspicuously absent from the will, Eleanor. She was erased from the family completely, Rebecca said. After her father remarried, it was as if she never existed. David knew they had uncovered a historical injustice, but he felt an obligation to share what they'd learned with someone who had a connection to the story. Through genealogical databases, Rebecca tracked down living descendants of the Ashford family. James Jr.'s grandson, Michael Ashford, was a retired architect living in Westchester County. When Rebecca called and explained they'd discovered new information about his great-grandfather's first wife, Michael agreed to meet them at a cafe in White Plains. He was a tall man in his 70s with gray hair and kind eyes. David brought a tablet containing the enhanced photographs and their research documentation. I knew my great-grandfather had been married before Victoria, Michael said, stirring his coffee, but it was never discussed. Family legend said his first wife died in an accident, and that it was too painful to talk about. David showed him the portrait of Eleanor first, without explanation. Michael studied the serious little girl in her white dress. She looks frightened, he said quietly. Then David showed him the enhanced images, the reflections in Eleanor's eyes, the falling woman, the shadow figure. He walked Michael through their research carefully, showing him the letters, the death certificate, the timeline, the evidence of James's financial crimes. Michael's face grew pale as he absorbed the information. When David finished, Michael sat in silence for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. My grandfather, James Jr., he was a difficult man, Michael finally said. Angry, controlling. He drank heavily and had a temper. My father barely spoke to him. I always wondered where that darkness came from. He looked up at David. Now I know. It ran in the family. I'm sorry to bring this to you, David said. Michael shook his head. No, you did the right thing. My great-grandfather murdered his wife and got away with it. That little girl saw everything and carried that burden her entire life. The truth deserves to be known, even if it's more than a century late. He asked about Eleanor, and Rebecca shared what they'd learned about her life. Her silence, her marriage, her quiet philanthropy, her dedication to helping other women escape violence. She sounds remarkable, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. I wish I could have known her. I wish our family had acknowledged her. Before they left, Michael made a decision. I want to fund a memorial, something that honors Catherine and Eleanor both. Can you help me do that? The memorial took 6 months to plan and create. Michael Ashford worked with a sculptor to design a bronze statue showing a woman and a young girl, hand in hand, looking toward the horizon. It was installed in a small park in Greenwich Village. not far from where Eleanor had lived for most of her adult life. The dedication ceremony took place on March 15, 2025, exactly 122 years after the photograph was taken. David and Rebecca were there, along with Michael and several other Ashford descendants who had learned the truth. Representatives from the women's organizations Eleanor had supported attended. Many of them moved to tears when they learned the full story. A plaque at the base of the statue read, "In memory of Catherine Morrison Ashford, 1875-1903, and her daughter Eleanor Ashford Whitfield, 1897-1978. Catherine's life was stolen by violence. Eleanor's voice was stolen by trauma. Though they were silenced, their truth endures." This memorial stands as testimony to all victims of domestic violence and to the resilience of survivors. Michael gave a brief speech, acknowledging his family's dark history and committing to supporting the causes Eleanor had championed. He announced the establishment of the Catherine and Eleanor Ashford Foundation, funded with a substantial portion of his inheritance, dedicated to providing legal advocacy and support services for women and children escaping abusive situations. After the ceremony, David stood before the statue as the crowd dispersed. Rebecca joined him, and they looked at the bronze figures in silence. "Do you think Eleanor would have wanted this?" Rebecca asked. "The attention, the memorial? She spent her life avoiding recognition." David thought about the woman who had turned her trauma into purpose, who had helped countless others while never speaking publicly about her own pain. "I think she would have wanted the truth to be known, not for her sake, but for all the other women and children who suffered in silence, whose stories were buried by powerful men." The original photograph now resided in the New York Historical Society's permanent collection, displayed alongside the research that had uncovered its secret. The exhibition was titled "Witness What Eleanor Saw," and it drew thousands of visitors in its first month. Many people stood before the portrait for long minutes, looking at the serious little girl and trying to imagine what she had experienced. Some wept. Some wrote comments in the visitor book expressing anger at the injustice, admiration for Eleanor's resilience, and gratitude that her story had finally been told. 3 months after the memorial dedication, David received an unexpected package. Inside was a small wooden box containing 2 items, a letter and a photograph. The letter was from a woman named Claire Morrison, who identified herself as Margaret Morrison's great-great-granddaughter. She explained that Margaret had kept a private collection of items related to her sister Catherine, passed down through generations of the Morrison family. Claire had read about David's discovery in the news and felt compelled to share what her family had preserved. The photograph showed 2 women sitting together in a garden, both laughing. One was clearly Catherine Ashford. David recognized her from census records and society pages. The other was Margaret. The image was undated, but appeared to have been taken in summer, probably 1902 or early 1903. "I wanted you to see her happy," Claire's letter concluded. "All of the public records show Catherine as a victim, and of course she was. But she was also a person who laughed and loved and had dreams. This photograph reminds us of that. Thank you for giving her and Eleanor the justice they deserved." David displayed the garden photograph next to his monitor, where he could see it while he worked. Catherine's smile was genuine and unguarded, captured in a moment of pure joy with her sister. It was a reminder that before the tragedy, before the violence, there had been a woman who deserved to live, to raise her daughter, to grow old with the people she loved. His phone rang. It was Rebecca. "The Times wants to do a feature article about Victorian-era forensic photography. They want to interview you about the technique you used. Will you co-author it?" David asked. "This was both of our work, of course. But David, there's something else." The Historical Society received 3 more photographs this week from people who saw the exhibition, old portraits that might contain similar evidence. They want to know if you'd be willing to examine them. David looked at Catherine's smiling face, then at Eleanor's haunted eyes in the 1903 portrait. How many other photographs existed with secrets hidden in plain sight? How many other stories waited to be uncovered? How many other truths had been buried by time and power? "Tell them yes," he said. "Tell them I'll examine everyone," because Eleanor couldn't speak for herself or her mother in 1903. But in 2025, her eyes had finally told their story. And if other photographs held similar testimony, David would make sure those voices were heard too. The past, it turned out, wasn't truly past at all. It lived on in images and documents, in the faces of descendants, in the consequences of actions taken generations ago. And sometimes, with the right tools and the right determination, justice could reach backward through time and touch lives that had been forgotten. David turned back to his work, the memory of a little girl's terrified gaze driving him forward. There were more photographs to examine, more secrets to uncover, more truths to bring into the light. Eleanor's eyes had waited 121 years to tell what they'd seen. He wouldn't let any other witness wait that long again.